Welcome to the Psychology of True Happiness Summit, a free online event featuring pioneering leaders in the fields of psychology, mindfulness, Hakomi, and more. Share this event with your friends and family, and come join us on Facebook at the Shift Network. And now your host, Lori Schwanbeck, co-founder of Mindfulness Therapy Associates.
Welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you with us today, and we're in for a treat. Today we have our guest, Dr. James Doty, with us. James is the director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford and a professor in the Department of Neurosurgery, also at Stanford University. He collaborates with scientists from a number of disciplines examining the neural, social, and moral basis of compassion. And as we've discussed, he's also good friends with a number of spiritual leaders. So, James, I'm so happy you're joining us today and sharing your wisdom. Thank you.
It's a wonderful joy to be with you today. So thank you for having me.
James, we are talking about happiness, well-being, and flourishing today. And you know a lot about well-being, not only through your research, but through your own life experience. You've shared in your recent book, Into the Magic Shop, about the extreme conditions you've experienced in your external life. You started out with a really difficult childhood and then had a period of time where you had a lot of material success and fortune. What did you learn about happiness and well-being, having lived in both of these extremes?
Well, it's interesting because when someone grows up in poverty or difficult circumstances, one of the things they believe that they need to make them happy is to have control, and one of the things that gives control, or at least they think gives them control, is position, power, and money. And so, as I spoke about in my book, I was 12 years old when I had a transformative experience happen to me, and that transformative experience was interacting with a woman in a magic shop who changed how I saw the world, how I reacted to the world, and as a result, how the world reacted to me. And she gave me the gift of many insights, her wisdom, and some techniques that allowed me to achieve. But as a 12-year-old, I missed some of her lessons, if you will, and I, as I said, like so many others, I wanted achievement, power, money, and I really believed that once I had that, I would just be so happy. And what happened was I achieved all of those things. I lived in a penthouse in San Francisco. It had a private elevator. I was driving a Ferrari. At least nominally, I was living what so many people believe is, quote unquote, the life. And yet, every day I would wake up more miserable than I had ever been in my entire life, because I was trying to fill an emptiness inside me that cannot be filled with material things, although I thought they could. And as the more and more material things I got, the more and more I realized that I was miserable. And the turning point came actually in an unexpected way, because during the dot-com crisis, everything collapsed, and I had investments and involvement in a lot of startups. And my millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars dissipated over a period of 6 weeks, and I was bankrupt. Wow. I lost everything. And as a result, because I had borrowed against those assets, I had to get rid of my penthouse, sell my villa in Italy, get rid of cars, and I was still bankrupt and millions of dollars in debt. But something happened, and the thing that happened actually was the greatest gift that I actually received, and in fact is what allows me to be with you today in this context. And when I had lost everything, I had made previously to that some commitments to charity, and I really wanted to live up to them. And the only asset I had left was stock in a company of which I had been the CEO at one time that had yet to go public. And to make a long story short, I decided to give every share of stock that I had to live up to those charitable commitments, even though I was bankrupt. And because after that event occurred, I tried to go all the way back to this interaction I had with this woman in this magic shop who shared her wisdom with me and try to understand how so much of those gifts had allowed for this transformation in my life, but why I was in this position. And what I had missed was that I had not completely opened my heart. I had not been as kind and compassionate to myself. I had not reached out to others. I was not being completely of service to others. And when I reflected on that, that gave me the strength and the insight and the wisdom to give all that stock away, which turned out when the company went public to be worth tens and tens of millions of dollars, which then allowed me to set up health clinics around the world, AIDS, HIV programs, fund a cardiovascular wing in a hospital in a third world, and also endow chairs at universities and research projects. And ultimately, it allowed me to create this center because I realized that the thing was missing was compassion, and trying to understand it, I decided to start studying it. And that allowed for the creation of the center at Stanford, but more importantly allowed for me to meet the Dalai Lama, who then shared his insight and wisdom with me, which then allowed me to meet other spiritual and religious leaders who have given me the incredible gifts of their time and their insights, and made me realize that meaning, happiness, contentment have to not do with yourself so much as having to do with how you can be with others, help others, and be of service to others.
Wow. I just want to pause for a moment and just take this in. So you had a really challenging childhood and must have been so excited at one level to finally make it. And you have the penthouse apartment, the Ferraris and everything, and to lose it in 6 weeks and then have some kind of inner wisdom to know that the little bit that you had left that you could give away, and just what that kind of act of generosity and service turned into is absolutely beautiful and inspiring. So I just wanted to note that. Really very inspiring. And one of the things I'd like you to speak about, if you could, is beyond this great story in your life, you've actually also researched what happens in our brain, in our nervous system when we are compassionate, when we do give and are generous. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on the inside?
No, absolutely, and it's actually quite fascinating and extraordinary. And what happens is, and it relates actually to our evolution as a species, is to have those attributes that make us human, which are theory of mind, abstract thinking, complex language. Our cortex had to get larger, and there occurred then an absolute requirement that our offspring are cared for 12, 15 years by their parent, especially the mother. But unlike other species who will run off into the forest or swim away, our offspring have to be cared for and nurtured, and they in fact mirror our behavior. And as a result, there is a hard wiring within us as a species that when we see others, especially children, our children, suffering or in need, we reach out to them to alleviate that suffering. And fundamentally, that is the definition of compassion. But why would you do that? And the reason you do that is that when you care, when you reach out to another, when you alleviate their suffering, you actually are rewarded. And that one of those rewards is a hormone called oxytocin, and many people call it the love or nurturing hormone. And what happens is when that hormone is released, your reward and pleasure centers are stimulated, and actually your parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, and you have a sense of calmness, fulfillment, and That is why when individuals care for another, it makes them feel good. And as we evolved as a species from the nuclear family to hunter-gatherer tribes, which was our survival strategy till 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, in those groups of 10 to 50, when an individual in your tribe or group, if you will, suffered, that could potentially put the group at risk. And again, the ability to look at microfacial expressions, body language, and even smell to know that someone was in need or suffering was critically important to our survival as a species. And this is held with us as we evolve culture, society, religion, and look at the fundamental core of every religion is compassion, because it's so central to our humanity. And so when an individual practices, if you will, compassion with intention, it results in you shifting oftentimes from a fear response, a threat response, which engages your sympathetic nervous system and which in modern society is often aggravated or activated as a result of just the nature of modern society and being overwhelmed. But when you act with compassion, it shifts to what we call our rest and digest system, our parasympathetic nervous system. When you're in that mode, you are able to be much more discerning and thoughtful because your executive control area is working at its best. And this is associated with increased creativity, productivity, and thoughtfulness. And again, when you're in that mode, your reward centers are activated through hormones such as oxytocin. And when that hormone is released, several things happen. Your heart rate decreases. Your heart rate variability increases, which is actually healthy. Your blood pressure lowers. The genetic expression of inflammatory hormones are diminished, and inflammation is a major cause of disease, especially cardiac disease, but many other diseases. And your immune system is boosted. And in fact, studies have been done in individuals, as an example, in one instance where a group of people volunteered, which could be analogous to compassion, compared with a group who did not, and this was a group over the age of 65. After following this group of people for a period of time, that group who practiced compassion, if you will, in a age-controlled matched study, demonstrated almost a 2 times increase in longevity compared to the non-volunteering group of people.
Wow. So it's good for us to be good to others, basically.
And in fact, the Dalai Lama says it is the only time it is okay to be selfish.
Yes. Well, we realize really maybe there's just one being here. Like our selfishness is really not about us. It's really about this connectivity that we all share, that we're wired for, really. I want to go back to oxytocin for a moment, if we can. So when we are compassionate, you said that we release the cuddle hormone or the love hormone of oxytocin. I've also heard that the release of oxytocin, while it connects us to people that we're close to, can also create more exclusion of people that we might be far from, so like that more in-group, out-group. What are practices that we can actually widen our circle of compassion so that the oxytocin can be triggered and flow with people that might not be as close to us?
Well, that's an excellent point. And as you point out, in fact, the effect of oxytocin really works with your tribe or the in-group. And this is one of the negative aspects of our evolution as a species. Obviously, early on, by connecting with people who looked like you, acted like you, now who think like you, or in the same socioeconomic class, because of that evolution, that holdover, we feel comfortable with those people. We trust those people, and this is feeling results in actually you shifting over from a fear or threat response to a sense of calmness because you're with, quote unquote, your tribe. Of course, the problem is, as you point out, in the modern world, it's a much more different situation. And the way you expand your circle of compassion, or if you will, promote a common humanity, is that you have to go from looking at the other as the other to being able to see the other as yourself. And the way you do that, as an example, is, let's say there is a person of a different religion. Instead of looking at what separates you, you look at what binds you. Typically, it's a set of values that many times, even across religions, are common. It's a desire for safety for your family, shelter for your family, for your kids, your children to have a better life. And when you start looking at the commonalities, instead of focusing on the attributes that separate you, that starts breaking down the barriers. And what we know is when individuals make efforts to connect with others, to, let's say, travel to different parts of the world, to actually interact with people who have belief systems that seemingly are far divergent from their own, when you're in these areas, when you're with these people for any period of time, you realize, in fact, there's very little that separates you. And it's this effort to always understand that reality and make that effort to connect. And then over time, those barriers that separate you actually dissolve into an understanding that actually you should be blind to it all and understand that what connects us ultimately is love.
Yes, beautifully said, that there's this shared humanness, and the currency between that and that connection is through the heart, is through love. And I always have wished that maybe our political leaders or world leaders could have this experience of tapping into that common humanity and break down the tribalism that we're seeing so strongly in our world today. Can you share a specific practice in how to cultivate this compassionate, seeing other people more like ourselves way of being?
Well, certainly mindfulness type practices are very effective, although with traditional mindfulness, of course, you realize that you can actually potentially create a mindful sniper. And of course, that's not compassion. So the critical components beyond mindfulness are the recognition that a lot of our own personal suffering is a manifestation of ourselves being critical to ourselves, not being kind to ourselves. And this results in a lot of emotional turmoil. And when you have inner emotional turmoil, that translates to outer emotional turmoil. So when you look at the work of Kristen Neff and others, and in regard to self-compassion, it's a very powerful gift you could give yourself, because when you can understand and accept that you're a fragile, frail human being who makes mistakes, who fails, and also all of us do, in fact, have a dark side. When you can accept that and still love yourself and realize that that is also part of our common humanity, that then allows you to have this next component, which is compassion for others, because you're no longer afraid of being judged, you're accepting of yourself, and you're also accepting of these same aspects in other people, and again, which connects you. And you understand that just like you deserve love and kindness and acceptance without judgment, and this is another key aspect, when you recognize that you deserve that, then that makes you understand that everyone deserves that. And that is my practice. As I mentioned in my book, Into the Magic Shop, I spent a period of time reflecting on my own journey and trajectory, and some of which we've talked about, and it ultimately led me to asked to give a talk to the medical students at my university, which was a medical school, which was a very big honor. And in that period of reflection preparing for that talk, it was summarized actually in a mnemonic that I created for these medical students, and ultimately what has become my practice. And it's 10 letters of the alphabet. It's C. Daily. I sit by the side of my bed. I sit up and appreciate the awe and the wonder of the universe. And then with intention, I go through these 10 letters of the alphabet and reflect on them. C is for compassion for self and others. D is the recognition of the dignity of every person. E is practicing equanimity. F is practicing forgiveness. G is having gratitude. H is being humble and recognizing that you're no better than another person. I is integrity and values. J is justice in the context of our responsibility as human beings to care for those who are vulnerable. K is the active component of kindness, all contained by L, love.
Wow, powerful words. Compassion, dignity, equanimity, forgiveness, gratitude, humble or humility, integrity, justice, kindness, and love. So you do that practice every day. Is that true?
Yes, and in fact, yes. But what I also do is actually a woman who heard that talk created a set of beads, 10 beads, wooden beads, and she added a 10th bead made out of gold to represent the golden rule. And she actually sells those to support charitable work that she does. And I was so moved by that I actually use those beads and I carry them with me every day. And multiple times throughout the day, I simply touch those beads and I pick a letter and close my eyes for 10 to 15 seconds, and it sets my intention.
So if I could ask you more specifically, so say you pick the bead of forgiveness, how would you then work with it when you close your eyes and set the intention? Will you just hold that word inside and see what it feels like, or is there a cognitive aspect to it? How do you very specifically work with each of these?
Well, it's both. I sit with that word, and then I think in my own present situation, is there somebody that I'm harboring a grievance or anger towards about some perceived act? And even though sometimes it's difficult because, we do get angry when we feel that we've been slighted or hurt by somebody, I sit there and look at them in my mind's eye and say, may you have peace. I forgive you. I hold no animosity towards you.
So it's very active.
Yes.
You're actively relating to this. It's beautiful. And I'm really struck by, you've said that you're an atheist, and these words that you have woven into these prayer beads are very much, part of the foundation of, as you said, many spiritual systems. And so I guess you can access this without needing to believe in a deity.
Well, no, of course, absolutely. And in fact, somebody asked me about that, and I tell people, there's really only one thing I know for sure. And while we can talk about possibilities, we can talk about, a God, if you will. We can talk about something beyond that. But the only thing I know with absolute certainty is that I'm present with you at this moment. And that is the only thing that I know. And that's how I live.
It's beautiful. And I'm so grateful you're present with me right now. I want to kind of weave back in here, Jim, something that you mentioned about our physiology. And when you are working with your prayer beads, if you will, there's a felt sense, like when you offer someone forgiveness and you kind of hold that in your mind and heart. What's happening at a physiological level when you work with each of these words and concepts and values?
Well, of course, incorporated with that is breathing, but what happens is that when you're able to calm your mind, when you're able to breathe, when you're able to hold these words and shift, as an example, we're talking about forgiveness. Well, what's associated with forgiveness? Oftentimes it's anger, oftentimes it's hostility, oftentimes it's fear, actually. And those types of thoughts result in stimulation of your sympathetic nervous system, your flight or fight response. And when that's activated, you have the release of cortisol, you have the release of epinephrine, you have the release of norepinephrine, and which on the savanna in Africa in a life-threatening circumstance is absolutely necessary for your survival. Your pupils dilate, blood is shifted from your abdominal tract, if you will, to your skeletal muscles so you can run, your sphincters tighten, and you're able to escape. But on a chronic basis, the release of these types of hormones have a very, very detrimental effect on your health. One is it shuts down your executive control function, which leads to less thoughtful decision-making and often quick decision-making, which is not discerning. It results in a depression of your immune system. It results in your heart rate variability becoming coherent, secondary to the release of what are called catecholamines. And when your heart rate variability is coherent or not variable, if you will, or is diminished, this is associated with sudden cardiac death. It also results in the genetic expression of inflammatory hormones. And so all of those things are at play when you have these, if you will, negative emotional states. And so by sitting with this and shifting to a state of kindness, compassion, inclusion, love, this takes you from that sympathetic nervous system activation to the parasympathetic nervous activation, where quite the opposite occurs. And then when you're in that state, you're discerning, you're thoughtful, you're creative, and you can see the true nature of reality, which is not one of a fear-based reality, but the true nature of reality is the reality that we are all connected, and that connection, or those who talk about particle or quantum consciousness, you might call particle entanglement, but I say it's love entanglement.
That's much more appealing.
Yes.
It's a really exciting time that we're in, that we're able to study through science what wisdom traditions have known for years, and have cultivated these practices of opening the heart, of dropping us beneath the reactive mind into that place of connectivity. And your work is very much, a bridge between the science and the spiritual. So I really appreciate that. I'm just wondering, just as we wrap up today here, Jim, if just given all we've talked about, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with as a next step that we can do to open our hearts and cultivate this quality of compassion and connection?
Well, what I'd like to say is that oftentimes many people feel either just simply overwhelmed by what's happening in society or in their own personal situation. And many times that feeling of being overwhelmed doesn't make them see as clearly that many other people are suffering. The other thing that happens to people is that they feel that they're just one person and that they can't do anything. and that they're limited either by finances or their position or even time. And what I tell everyone is that no matter who you are, no matter what position you're in, that you have the capacity every day to improve the life of at least one person. And when you improve the life of one person, you improve your own life.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. And I want to thank you so much, Jim, for the research that you've done in this field, your philanthropic work, your inspiration, and really thank you for the care that you've given to those early days in the magic shop with this woman who really taught you some practices that you're now sharing with all of us. So I really deeply appreciate your presence with us today. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. And for anyone who might be interested in more information about the book, there is a website called intothemagicshop.com. And the other thing which I didn't mention, Oxford University Press will actually be publishing an academic text, the very first of its kind, called The Handbook of Compassion Science, of which I'm the senior editor, and one of your other speakers, at least, Emma Seppala, is one of the editors. This will really become, I believe, the Bible of this field. It is a multi-authored collection of the latest research in this field.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you all for joining us today.
And thank you. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Psychology of True Happiness Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To learn more, visit psychologyoftruehappiness.com. To join our global community of people awakening to their divine humanity and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for gathering with us and for sharing this empowering path with your friends and family.